We will start our next panel, and leading into the discussion, let me just say a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank Dean Michael Scharf and Case Western Law School for all they've done in supporting the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. And with a tremendous team headed by Steve Petrus, including Kai Carmody on the Canadian side and Ted Perrin, I think they put together a wonderful program again this year, and I'm pleased to be part of it. You know, one thing that should be understood is that while we're called the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, we talk about things far beyond black letter law. We talk about policy issues concerning Canada and the United States, and I think that has to be appreciated by everybody, that it is not just a bunch of lawyers talking about statutes and regulations. We deal with issues of policy that are timely and pertinent and need to be discussed. And we're unique. This is a bit of advertising. We're unique in the sense that I don't think there's any other institute that deals with Canada-U.S. issues as we do. So just tell your friends, and if you're not members of the Institute, I urge you to take out a membership. It's a wonderful body. It's been around, as we know, since 1976, and we plan to continue for another 40 or 50 years, if not more. And the other thing I should say is I'm a stand-in. Chris Sands, who is the Director of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, could not be here, largely, as I understand it, due to 737 issues. Transportation was just impossible to get him here on time. Chris Sands is one of the most well-informed experts on Canada-U.S. relations, and I'm humbled by being asked to stand in for Chris, but here I am. So let me now talk about the panel. We've had a discussion already at high political levels, and now we're going to drill down a little bit and talk about certain specific laws, policies, instruments that can be used to deal with climate-related issues. And we have a first-class panel. We couldn't be better served than having Martha Hall Finlay, Lana Pollock, and John Godfrey on the panel. Now, you've all got written material in front of you, so you know their detailed bios, but let me just introduce them very briefly. Martha Hall Finlay, who I've known for many, many years, is a leader in public policy thinking in Canada. She's been a member of Parliament, and she has had activities in the private sector as legal counsel in the information and technology business. She now heads one of Canada's premier think tanks, the Canada West Foundation, based in Calgary. And I might add that we are so pleased to have Western Canada represented here at our annual conference. Next to her is Lana Pollock, again, a leader in policy, someone who has served politically in the legislature as you've heard from Jim Blanchard, who stole my lines a little bit, he often does, in the legislature in Michigan. She has had a major role in policy development, both in her state and at the national level, and she is now the chair of the U.S. section of the International Joint Commission, an incredible institution formed by Canada and the United States in 1909, a groundbreaking body dealing with environmental, boundary water related issues. And when you think about it, well over 100 years ago, there was a bilateral body constituted by the two countries to deal with common problems, and Lana will talk more about that in due course. And finally, if I may, next to her is John Godfrey, who we heard last night, and who kindly consented to do double duty today, standing in for Joanna Defoe, Senior Policy Advisor in the Canadian Environment Ministry, who could not be here. And John, you know his biography, again, someone who has served in government as a member of Parliament and in the academic world. He was also editor of the Financial Post before entering politics, and he recently chaired a task force in the government for the Government of Ontario on environmental issues. So John, we're so very pleased you were able to take up this double duty role again this morning. So let me start the discussion. And by the way, I should say, each of the panelists has agreed to limit their formal remarks to 10 to 12 minutes to allow us to have enough time for an exchange with the participants, with the audience. And I want the students particularly to feel free to ask questions. In fact, we encourage the students to take an active role in the question period that we will have after the opening remarks of each of our panelists. So, that having been said, let me start with Martha Hall Finley and ask her for her opening comments. Martha.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. It is a real pleasure to be here. I don't get to do the lawyer part of my world very often, so I'm very much looking forward to this and to the discussion with the audience. And I do thank you for noticing the Western piece. I do think it's really important. Even at home in Canada, we find it frustrating often to have a lot of these discussions don't, in fact, include different regions of the country. And it is as you know, it's a really big country because it's big like the one here, and different perspectives are often important. I actually changed my notes for this morning based on the earlier discussion and based on, John, your comments last night. In particular, appreciated the emphasis on the opportunities for cities, for municipalities, cities and towns to be engaged. So I've brought it into three components. One is a little bit of an optimistic piece that certainly from our perspective, what's really changing things is not, in fact, government regulation, is not, in fact, specific approaches that are political or governmental or even legal. An awful lot of the change that's happening worldwide is coming because money talks. And the more conversations that we have been having with the global investment community, particularly in energy, that's an area that we're involved in, and so that happens to be a big part of the global investment community's focus. And frankly, Canada is not seen as a very good place to invest because a lot of our activities have in fact ground to a halt. There's some environmental activists that might think that that's a really good thing because we're not actually able to export a number of our energy products the way we might like to, and we can talk about that in a minute. My point is, whether you agree or disagree, I am very positive and hopeful that what we're hearing from the investment community, and of course, they're reflecting the not just the desires, but increasingly the demands of their sources of money. So pension funds, individual shareholders, consumers who drive behavior that in fact then makes investment decisions because, of course, you want to invest in companies that are addressing the needs or desires of consumers. So that's one point I want to make, that I'm very hopeful that a lot of change is happening because of money. And indeed in the Canadian energy industry, and you know, there was some talk about it before, and I think Jim Blanchard really pointed out that an awful lot of energy companies are in fact leading the way in renewable energy. So it's a bit of an unknown thing and perhaps a bit counterintuitive, but money talks, and they know that the future is there as well. And so there's terrific investment in wind and solar and geothermal and hydrogen and all sorts of really, really interesting things. And what I'd like to say is that, and echoes a bit Peter's comments about the the optimism around technology. Technology and technological innovation, even in the Canadian oil sands, has now brought oil sand oil to be lower in GHG emissions than California heavy crude, than the Venezuelan options that we're quite happy to import. And so to the extent that even the oil coming from the oil sands, you might not like the fact that the world is using oil. We would all love to actually see an alternative tomorrow, but that's not going to happen. And to the extent that the world is going to continue, like it or not, to use and consume fossil fuels, at least for the foreseeable number of decades, a few decades, and don't get me wrong, we can all say we would love that not to be the case, but the reality is, and somebody asked the question last night too, I mean, we have to recognize that there is energy poverty around the world, and it is a little rich, pardon the pun, or maybe pun intended, for the developing world to say, it's okay, we've done all of this damage, you can't have cheap and readily accessible energy because it happens to be fossil fuel based. And so to the extent that we are recognizing that that will still be the case, I personally am really excited at what's happening from a technological perspective in terms of reducing the footprint wherever we can in the context of realizing what's happening in terms of consumption. But investment is driving those innovations. It's interesting that companies are realizing that doing the right thing, as in reducing greenhouse gas emission footprint, is also lowering costs. And even in the last few years, the mindset and the realization that these are win-wins is really quite extraordinary, and it's going to continue apace. The next piece I wanted to talk about was, in fact, politics, and where we have encountered a problem. And I have to say, quite a few years ago, was a part of an effort in Canadian politics to implement a federal carbon tax. I have significant scars on my back from that effort because it became so politicized. And I now see, so let me just say, we lived through a year and some of the slogan became job-killing carbon tax. And it really, it took hold, and it ended up, I think, putting the effort years back, in fact, to actually get to the point where we can implement a price on carbon. The unfortunate thing, and this is again the politicization and the fact that politicians can't, if you go to the table and you say, I'm right and you're wrong, we're not going to compromise, we're not going to get anywhere, frankly. And so now we have a situation with the Canadian federal government where a new attempt to bring in legislation, and I will talk about C-69, but not now, because I think it's an important part of the discussion. Legislation, regulatory legislation, and an effort at a carbon tax. But frankly, it was done too ideologically. It was done without recognition that certain regions and certain parts of the country we need to understand more how to manage different regions, different needs, rural versus urban. And unfortunately, it was done in such an ideological way that it basically handed the opponents of carbon pricing another opportunity to go down the path of the political slogan of job-killing carbon tax. And so unfortunately, because of the ideological I'm right, you're wrong approach, and this is nonpartisan, or actually maybe multi-partisan, everyone's guilty of this. It's certainly in our country. And as a result, we're not getting far enough forward. And so we really do need to find a way to find compromise and collaboration. I would finally add because I realize we're short of time for these intro remarks, but I'm just going to add now in terms of where we might be able to cooperate, because that is the title of the conference. I'm going to set the stage with just a scenario to offer the question. The Paris Agreement, everybody who signed on to it, we all have set ourselves targets for greenhouse gas emissions, but they're territorial targets. They're not consumption targets. They're actually production, and they're territorial based. So here's a dilemma for Canada and the United States, or I would think maybe an area of potential cooperation. Canada's trying to build a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline to the west. We have tons of pipelines, by the way. We have tons of natural gas pipelines, but we're trying to build another one to a plant that can actually create liquid natural gas, which we would like to be able to export to China. So if we look at global greenhouse gas emissions, which is in fact what we should be looking at, is global reduction, net reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions, to the extent that there's an argument, and I think it's a very strong one, that clean LNG, or cleanly produced LNG, displacing coal-fired electricity in China is in fact a very good thing, even though liquid natural gas is a fossil fuel and it does use some to actually make it liquid. But if the net result is reduction, that's great. Except the system we have now after Paris doesn't actually allow us to really calculate, well, if there's a net reduction in China, but it actually means a net increase in GHG emissions in Canada, how do we settle that? But that same pipeline, if in building that pipeline, we use Canadian steel, then we actually, if we want to calculate the GHGs associated with that project, we have to include the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the fabrication of that Canadian steel in Canada. I'm fine with that, except that the way the system is structured, if we import American steel, we don't have to include those greenhouse gas emissions in terms of being associated with that project. That doesn't make any sense to me. So I think, and I throw it out, there's some interesting work being done in this area. There's an opportunity, I think, whether it's Canada, US, I would prefer to think perhaps North American-wide, an opportunity to figure out how we can actually make some more sense out of what we're trying to do in terms of a larger effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There.
Thank you.
Tried to rush
Thank you,
that.
Martha.
There you go.
Very, very well done.
Thank you very
Lana.
much. And thank you for inviting me here. I'm pleased and honored, and most importantly, I'm learning. I have been with the IJC for nigh unto 9 years. It's a relatively long period of time for a commissioner if you look over the last 110 years. In that time, I've been with the commissioners that have been Harper appointments, working with Obama people. Now we still have Obama people, and there's Trudeau administration, but they have yet to make their appointments, so we are effectively shut down and waiting for the government of Canada to make those appointments. So I say that because it's important, and we have important people here, and I hope you will carry that back, because the longer we're not in session, the less relevant we become, the less helpful we become, and I think we have a history of being very helpful to both countries, so that's out there. I know they're distracted, but I don't think there's any controversy. It's just distraction and other business, so. Okay. IJC works, of course, all the way across the boundary, certainly in the western basins, and as far east as St. Croix, New Brunswick in Maine. And in all of those basins, we have witnessed and lived with the people there who are suffering today and yesterday and indeed the whole 9 years I've been on, from the consequences of climate change. There's extraordinary flooding. There's extraordinary flooding, sometimes followed by drought in the same year. There's all sorts of consequences that are costly and harmful, and IJC is frankly helping. We're the only organization that can work with Environment Canada, EPA at the same time, Fisheries and Oceans, and the Interior Department. We do all these things, and we're quite effective. And I will, due to time, not go into some of the programs and the policies that we've helped these agencies and governments, jurisdictions, both at the provincial and the federal level, develop and refine to better deal with, that is to say, to adapt to the consequences of climate change. They're there. I'm proud of that work, Everybody who's been associated, certainly our extraordinary staff and the boards who both volunteer their time and well, they all volunteer their time. There's been improvements. We are, like our governments, both governments are, pretty good at adaptation. We are lousy, and I would say irresponsible as our governments, in addressing mitigation. Now, I also want to pause to say what I should have said at the beginning. There are people in the offices, civil servants and people in Ottawa, who get very nervous when I talk. Mark, don't laugh. And so I want to make clear, these are my comments. I will respond. I respond to the IJC. I represent the IJC, but not everything I say represents the positions of the IJC. When I say that the IJC, like our governments, should be addressing mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gases, as well as adaptation, which we're doing very well. I mean, I'm proud of that. It's pragmatic, it's helpful, it's cutting edge stuff in these various basins. But when I say that, I'm not speaking for the IJC, because the IJC doesn't deal with mitigation. We just deal with the consequences. And I am here to say I think it's time that everybody deals with the cause as well as the consequences. I'm also here to say that, as Jim Blanchard, I think, pointed out, and John also, it's hard to deal with the consequences. And it's going to be particularly hard, I understand, for Canada, because I believe a larger part of the Canadian economy, and also a more concentrated, geographically concentrated development of the energy that's real. Those are real lives, that's real economies, that's real. But that doesn't mean we can wait decades and export Canadian oil sands to China or LNG to China. We can't do it, or we'll have this, what I hadn't actually ever heard or considered, and I'm speaking for myself, not the IJC, the term climate change or climate genocide. We do not have the time. And so, I mean, Millie and Sam, my grandchildren, a year-old and almost 3 years old. How many people here have children or grandchildren who were born in this century? So they're virtually all going to live through whatever it is we bequeath to them. And we don't have the time to wait. We have to leave that stuff in the ground, and we have to recognize the economic impact on those regions especially, and those individual people who are going to be bearing the brunt of this massive, essential readjustment. We can't just let the people who, as Peter said, I mean, they drive 200 miles to work, or kilometers to work. I mean, they drive a long way. They're poor. They can't do it. But that doesn't mean, oh, therefore we can't do it. That doesn't mean, okay, we'll stand by and let the seas rise and the ice melt and the glaciers disappear in the Himalayan mountains so that billions of people in Asia will be without water. Try that for an immigration consequence. I mean, I've been full of admiration for your Prime Minister, especially in contrast to our current president, as you've greeted, Canada has greeted and embraced Syrian refugees who are climate refugees, essentially. But I would ask quiz time, as Professor Tackley said today, you're looking at, and this is, and I think he would agree, this is IPCC's assessment, and they're always conservative. Every mark that the IPCC has had since going back to its establishment, we've overshot it, because IPCC is an extraordinarily conservative, consensus-driven organization. So if IPCC says we've got about a meter to go in Sam and Millie's lifetime of sea level rise, and it's very likely to be more, who in this room, Professor, you don't get to answer this, who in this room can say what a meter of sea rise represents in terms of climate refugees? What's the number? How many? 50 million? Do I hear another number? 100 million. The United States couldn't even deal with 100,000 refugees, in New Orleans a few years ago. This is hard stuff. And if we think we're going to do this and wait because and this is my second to last comment for time, if we think we're going to wait to benefit the people of Zimbabwe and Mozambique because they haven't had a chance to develop, are we doing them a favor today? They're bearing the consequences of waiting. Yes, they need energy, but they can't wait to have energy the way we had energy. The poorest on the planet will surely suffer the most. So the thinking that we are delaying in any way because we are helping the undeveloped, I think needs to be reconsidered. But what I would say is what we all need to do, and our legislators need to do, our leaders need to do, we need to say, yeah, it's going to hurt Calgary a lot. But that doesn't mean, and many other interests in people, a lot. Doesn't mean we can't figure out a way to have a carbon tax or some other mechanism and still take the burden off the poor people who have to drive the distance to work and heat their homes from a distance and with something not as good as we'd like. The last thing I'll say before we have our conversations is we're treating the atmosphere like an open sewer. Now that also is not an IJC position or statement, but it's a true statement. And we have to stop thinking it's free. If we had people upstream of us, and we're a city living with people upstream of us, and they start dumping ethyl methyl bad stuff, I'm not a chemist, in the water upstream, the best action shouldn't be to pass out water filters to the people downstream. We should do something upstream to stop the stuff going in the first place. And it's costly, and it's hard, and it's disruptive, but not nearly as much so as doing nothing and greeting those 100 million or 200 million climate refugees. Thanks.
Thank you, Lana. John.
Well, thanks very much. And before I say anything, I want to recognize that John McKay has arrived, and it's also his birthday. Oh. Happy birthday, John. So I want to basically try to be an over-the-horizon radar person. You know, over-the-horizon radar sees things that are beyond the immediate horizon. And in a way, what I want to talk about are two things which have been referenced this morning, one by Martha and one by Carlos. I'm going to try two sets of initials on you. who knows right off the top what a BCA is? Oh, how gratifying. Oh, how wonderful. We've got something to talk about and learn about. Who knows what these initials stand for? TCFD. Oh, even better. So this is really going to be stuff that is coming at us that we will have to take into account, where policy will have to become law, I think, but it's not on your radar right now.
So those are not basketball teams?
They are, they're not even in the March Madness. So the first one, which is BCA, is border carbon adjustment. What is a border carbon adjustment? It relates to the problem that Martha raised. What do we do with the CO2 which is embedded in US steel but would have to compete against Canadian steel, which is being penalized for the CO2 that's embedded in it? How do we make that fair? Well, that's a really great question, because it's not just about US steel, it's about imports from any part of the world. So, for example, when the United Kingdom says, well, we've really reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. No, you haven't. You've actually just transferred it to China, where you bought a lot of stuff which you've imported, which doesn't count in your CO2 emissions. It's just simply a transfer from one place to another. Well, one of the interesting projects which folks are working on is this very problem, which is, how do we make it fair? Now, when Ontario was doing its cap and trade scheme, and California's and Quebec as well, one of the thoughts was that you would spare trade-exposed sectors. So in other words, that in the steel question, in the steel case, even though you recognize that in Canadian steel there was a certain percentage, because you didn't want to wipe out the Canadian steel industry or the Canadian cement industry, you simply gave them free allowances to allow them to transition to some future date, and therefore you didn't open yourself up to being swamped with foreign imports that didn't reflect their carbon content. The alternative strategy, which folks have been working on, and it's if it were an easy strategy, I'm sure it would have been adopted by now by more, is to bring in a border carbon adjustment. What that means is that you ascribe to an import of US steel a certain amount of carbon, that you simply say, well, unless you can prove to the contrary, we will assume that you used up this much carbon, that much is embedded in your product, and that until you'll be penalized for that the way our own people are penalized. You'll be given national treatment. So there's a certain logic to this, that you're treating everybody the same, but you're ascribing to the foreign importer a certain value. Now that may seem a little arbitrary, but happily, the International Organization of Standards, the ISO, has been working on this problem. And they are developing methodologies. There are now ISO standards, which are life cycle, so they take into account the raw materials, the processing, the transportation, and by the way, the disposal at the end of the life. There are measures which allow you to assess what other people's products are in terms of their CO2 emissions. And that the trick would be that you would say, well, look, we're not discriminating against your import, but we insist that you reveal how much is in your product, and then, you will be treated exactly the way we treat our own, whether it's through a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. So there's an equalization. Now this implies eventually the certain kind of interference, if you like, because it means that you have to be able to know what happened to that plant in China or wherever else. But we do this in other realms, right? We do it for child labor. You have to prove a certification that your product was not the product of child labor. And so it's complicated, But it's intriguing as a solution to the problem of carbon leakage or displacement or unfair trade. So that would be my first point. Keep an eye on that one. And as I say, there is a more and more sophisticated response to that. The trick is you have to allow for inspectors to go in and see exactly what's going on. You can't simply take the foreign plant at its word that it's low producing in carbon dioxide. So that's the first one. Border carbon adjustments are a kind of an interesting solution to carbon pricing in North America, number one. So the second set of initials was the TCFD. So the TCFD is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Now, now that I've given you the fuller part, I'm sure that some of you know about this. This is the product of the Financial Stability Board, which has been headed up by Mark Carney, again, the Canadian-born governor of the Bank of England, and Michael Bloomberg. So they, about 2 or 3 years ago, commissioned, created an international task force to deal with two problems. How, as investors, do we know whether public companies, and particularly financial institutions, how are they doing in two areas? How are they doing in mitigating the production of greenhouse gases? So they call that transitional risk. How do they assess the risk of a company which is really exposed to having a lot of carbon in its portfolio? That's the first one. And then the second risk is physical risk. How do companies reveal how exposed they are to interruption of business, for example, because of extreme weather events? So these two risks are now confronting the corporate world. And so what the task force said was, no longer will the directors of public companies be able to say they didn't know, because they do know. We've told you, everybody else has told you, the science is getting stronger, it's undeniable, you can't claim you didn't know. That's not going to be a defense in the future. And what you do about it has to be reflected in 4 elements of corporate policy. It has to be reflected in your governance structure. It has to be reflected in your risk management plan. It has to be reflected in your strategic plan. And it has to be reflected in the various indicators you use to tell investors and the world about your company. So this report came out about 1.5 years ago, and it's had a profound effect. First, on about 400 corporations which have signed up around the world to do this. And secondly, naturally, the financial regulators are looking at this and saying, well, this isn't just simply, in the past, language about climate change and environment was kind of descriptive. In your reporting structure, it was optional. It really wasn't something that you would be held accountable for. But increasingly, they're going to say, this is approaching a material risk. This is a material fact which investors must know about if they're going to make sensible investments. And what's going to be really important, of course, is that boards of directors are going to be held liable. They're going to be, if they do not produce that kind of disclosure on both kinds of risk, the carbon risk and the physical risk, due diligence, they will have been determined they haven't done their due diligence. And I think this is going the way of tobacco, that increasingly you won't be able to get away with it, to be able to try and deny it or push it aside or not take it into account. And when I was listening to Carlos suggest that one approach might be to go to declare this a form of genocide, that's a pretty high standard. And it also raises all kinds of emotional issues, and it's probably true, but it's challenging, and I think probably, and I'll let all of you lawyers tell me in more detail, it's probably a much higher burden of proof. But if I take it down to disclosure of your vulnerability on carbon and on physical risk, then we're in a much lower burden of proof. And by the way, with every passing climate event, it just becomes that much more obvious that you can't ignore it. So these are two emerging areas which I think will, first of all, become policy and eventually become law. And it will not be limited, by the way, to simply the corporations themselves. More importantly, the financial institutions which are funding and investing in those corporations. So it's really at the financial services level, the insurance business, the pension business, the investment business, the banking business. They're all going to be covered by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. They will be, and it will be a rising pressure as it was in the past with tobacco or investments in South Africa. It's a coming thing. And we should keep an eye on it, and I think it's only going to go one way. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. And I thank all of the panelists, because as I watched them on my stopwatch, they all kept within their allotted time, and they came under the 12-minute threshold. So that being said, I'm going to give each of them 1 minute to comment on what they've heard the others say. So Martha, please begin.
Thank you. Task force, it's not just risk. That's the focus of the task force, which is fantastic. But what I was alluding to earlier was, in terms of the global investment community, there's also a reaction to other, whether it's investors, consumers, not just saying, uh-oh, risk, they're saying, we want you to behave better. We want you to be greener. And so there's a negative, there's a disincentive, and then there's an incentive, which I think is incredibly valuable. And so I thanks, John, for elaborating on the task force, because it speaks to my earlier point. Money talks, and money is actually going to be hugely influential here. I don't have enough time to, 1 minute doesn't get me to talk about what's happened, fantastic innovation based here in Cleveland with respect to water. So I will do that later in the panel. So I do just want to talk about the issue about trade exposed and what the ISO is doing. It's the ISO 14,000 series of their standards. It can't just be trade exposed. It can't just be a border adjustment, because those still end up being territorially based issues. The ISO is not a government body. It needs, for some of that extremely important work to work, we also need the political collaboration. And I know it's tough, because Paris was tough enough to get. We all know how hard it was to get global agreement on anything. But because the commitment was to territorial-based production of greenhouse gas emissions, in order for us to take full advantage of what the ISO is doing in terms of addressing my steel challenge, we're going to need broader political collaboration to say it's not just an economic trade exposed, it's also how do we account properly for our collaborative effort, or not yet collaborative efforts, but our collective efforts, even if they're calculated individually, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So anybody's interested, the ISO, it's a 14,000 series, really, really interesting work, but it can't work without that political collaboration as well. Phew.
Lana.
I would like to pick up on something both of my colleagues have said here. One is, what we do has to be fair. And you mentioned, Martha, the sense that that tax wasn't going to be fair. And once people believe something is not fair, they should fight it. So we need to watch our language as well as the content of how we present our ideas. So that's one thing. At the very least, and this isn't, I just started writing what you could call it, but till you come up with a better, it should be a fair carbon tax, and if you can come up with something better, but it should be fair and it should be represented that way. The second thing is when John started talking, you know, he's a real nerd, and a brainiac, and that's what we need. And Martha, you lead, you know, an institution full of brainiacs. And so what we need to do is settle on what needs to be done as a society, and as a global community, stop fighting about what needs to be done, start agreeing, get realistic on the timeline that it needs to be done, and put the kind of brains that I'm sitting between to work on how to do it. There's too much time spent, well, we can wait, or we can do it, or it's over here, that, the Mozambique people only have had one cyclone, and, and we need more farm land to grow more corn, not to eat, but to burn. And let's figure out what needs to be done, because there really is agreement on that. The hard things is the policy. There's wonky things that will work to make it fair. And my last point is, because I like to go back to IJC, because I'm not talking a lot about it, and yet I'm so proud of what we have been able to do in looking at adaptation. One of the things we've called for, not specifically with relationship to climate change, but as EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, which is another way of saying the life cycle tracking, and with the ISO and all the things that you've mentioned, that is a mechanism. It's a policy mechanism that could be developed much more strongly and could be a substantial contributor. That is in the first IJC's annual TAP, Triennial Assessment of Progress report, and it's a concept worthy of considerable development. Canada, I think, is a little ahead of the United States in various ways in applying that principle in different provincial law and programs.
John?
Well, very quickly, I just want to pick up on something that Lana said, which is, of course, all about part of the work of the IGC or a great part of it is focused on the Great Lakes. And since we're beside one of them here, I just want to point out to one significant information gap, which makes it difficult even to relate what kinds of risks we may be exposed to, which is that certainly in Ontario, and it may well be the case here in Ohio as well, we lack something called downscaled climate data. We know quite a lot about what's going to happen in general terms, as Jean pointed out. This does relate to Jean's remarks just as much. In general terms, over the next 50 years, in terms of increased water, increased storms, heat waves, all the rest of it. What we don't know is how it's going to play out on about a 5 square kilometer footing. But there's incredible work going on, and particularly by a guy at the University of Toronto who's an atmospheric physicist, which builds on the work which is being done in Quebec through Uranos, which is a climate modeling collaborative, to be able to do what they call dynamic downscaling, which allows you to understand what happens when all of the various complex things are happening in the atmosphere and they meet the surface. At that interface, what happens? And one of the extraordinary things that happens at the Great Lake level is that the Great Lakes throw everything off. It's like if you had mountains, it would be the same kind of challenge. So you get snowfalls of 0% in Niagara-on-the-Lake on Lake Ontario, and then you go 50 kilometers to Buffalo and you get 6 feet of snow. That's lake effect. And anybody who's a skier, by the way, in Southern Ontario knows a lot about this. So we, in order to make the kind of plans for adaptation and resilience, so that if we're going to build a new piece of infrastructure, a bridge or anything else, and we want to know what the new reality is about a 100-year storm or wind or anything else, we need that kind of data in order to plan better and protect our population from what's coming at us. Uranos has a long history of this with its huge supercomputers and all the rest of it. And the rest of us need it as well. And we need it, by the way, for any of our financial institutions which are investing around the world, increasingly in infrastructure and in real estate, because the same arguments apply. If you're going to buy a port in Sydney, you better know more accurately about sea level rise and sea surges and all that kind of stuff, because it'll affect our pensions, right? And increasingly, we're investing around the world thinking that it's safer to get into infrastructure and real estate than stocks and bonds, when it's actually worse, because it's being subjected to increasing extreme weather events. So that's a missing scientific piece which we need to focus on.
Can I just, one quick thing? I would say that the scientists and the investors, and certainly the reinsurance companies, are way ahead of a lot of other people who are still either denying it or fussing with detail. The politicians, in their wisdom, and I don't want to get the wrong state, I think it's South Carolina, but it might be North Carolina, they have created a law, a requirement that no plans for future ports, roads, infrastructure can include presumptions or assumptions that there's going to be any change in climate. You have to use the last 100 years. You can't use science be damned. I'd say the voters really need to look at who they've elected.
So as frustrating as that is, can I just got the permission from our chair to actually tell my story about where Ohio and in fact Cleveland did the opposite not too long ago. So there's an old friend of mine now passed away by the name of Bill Pryor, and he was a co-founder of a company called Connecticut, which is is a worldwide company in terms of water treatment, a lot of residential water treatment, but also to the municipal-sized water treatment activities. And one of the things that they developed a number of years ago, not too many years ago, was a system that Bill used to call toilet to tap. I told him many times that's probably not your best marketing slogan. But the point was that they had developed water recycling. They were one of the original technologies in terms of membrane for water treatment years ago. But this newer approach was a full closed loop opportunity. And there is a residential house that's been operating, and I'm not sure where it is here in Cleveland, and a small commercial property that have been operating entirely closed loop for the last several years. So I'm not just talking gray water. That's been around, recycling gray water has been around for a long time. I'm talking entire closed loop with the toilet piece into completely purified water and dry waste. The opportunities for this technology are huge, but what they came up against was a regulatory barrier that in Ohio you could not use anything that related to sewage. So anything that had been through or been through, you could not use it, regardless of how pure the ultimate water was. They worked for years to get the legislation changed to say, but if the science shows that the water is pure, then we should be able to do this. Ultimately, the Ohio, legislature, the Ohio government, in its wisdom, not only overturned that regulation, but did so unanimously, because the science was overwhelming to say, here, you have an opportunity, a full, total closed-loop water recycling technology that you can actually now use. Now, Bill passed away a couple years ago. The company's been in a bit of transition. But think of that as an opportunity, not from having just recognized the science, but the opportunity for the world in terms of small community recycling. Like I said, they might want a different slogan, but the opportunity is terrific. So that's an example, a positive example, right here in Cleveland of where government and politicians have in fact been able to embrace an opportunity. I'm hopeful. I mean, notwithstanding whichever Carolina it was. There are good stories too.
Of course.
So we're going to go to you for a question and answer period. Let me just make a comment. If you followed the progression of our discussions from last night to now, you see that we've talked about the need for global intergovernmental action, fundamental need for countries of the world to do something on a common and serious challenge. We've talked about the need for governmental and intergovernmental action at a more specific level. We've talked recently, the last few minutes, about community action to deal with the issues. And we've talked, John has mentioned it, we've talked about corporate action, and we've explored each of those levels, and I think that that has been a very good development as we've progressed in these discussions. One of the things I think that needs more attention by everybody involved in climate change law and policy is the impact of private sector regulation, which has kind of been ignored in the discussion. But, you know, there are private sector standards not related to government legislation. And one of them is the whole area of corporate social responsibility, where corporations are judged in the marketplace on what they are doing to deal with climate change issues, not because governments have forced them to do that, but because the markets have dictated that their stock price will depend on how effective their CSR programs are, and that engages things like labor relations, standards, and environmental issues that a particular company is pursuing, as I said, not because governments have dictated, but because the markets have. And I think that's an area that needs further exploration. Anyway, that being said, let's start and have some vigorous questions. Over here, yes, sir.
One of my college roommates is a laser chemist, and he's at Rutgers University, and his colleague just won the Nobel Prize for chemistry, Donna Strickland, with laser chemistry. So we've been talking a lot about climate and lasers and radars and how they're now measuring what is happening that comes from the solar system and from the star system. And what's being found from the NOAA satellites is that the outer two layers of the atmosphere, the ionosphere and the exosphere, have been cooling. And there's indications that the cooling started 4 years ago, and the cooling is getting cooler in the last 2 years. So that's now being handed over to the solar scientists to say, what is this happening with the solar cycle? And some solar scientists are saying that a cooling trend is happening, and it's somewhat slight right now, but it'll grow. Now, I'm not a solar scientist, but could it be that this may be leading to a cooling of our lower levels of the atmosphere, maybe giving more time to deal with these climate effects so that we're not talking about climate genocide?
I think we need Professor Tackley on this. Can you respond to that?
Come over and have a mic.
This is the first time I've heard of that particular issue. I should say, however, that there are, at the time, as we measure that the troposphere, the lower atmosphere, is warming, we also know that a natural consequence of that is the stratosphere is cooling. But that's driven by the greenhouse gases. I think what you're saying is that there may be something in the output of the sun that is interacting with the exosphere and the ionosphere. Well, the exosphere is probably not an issue because those molecules are leaving anyway. But the ionosphere or the upper stratosphere, I don't know about that, and I don't know how strong that connection is with what's happening at the surface. But we're talking there about a very low density environment. So even though it might be warming, so to speak, but molecules are so far apart that what we mean by temperature is even called into question. So it's the magnitude. We'd have to look at the magnitude, the amount of heat. I mentioned zeta joules in the ocean. So we need to compare the amount of energy that is either leaving or entering there with the amount of energy that we already have stored in the ocean, for instance, there may be, could compensate for that. It's something that definitely needs to be looked at, but I think we have to make sure we're talking about comparable amounts of energy and so that we can make decisions about what happens here where it's going to affect us. It's going to affect the human society over the next 100 years.
And this is a good example of a discussion that should be taking place offline between the two of you.
Absolutely, yeah. This is kind of wonky
Yeah.
stuff. But it's the kind of thing that needs to get into the scientific community because this is what scientists gravitate to. Here's a new potential area of uncertainty. We need to get on that right away.
Jim Blanchard. Thank you, Dr. Tackley.
Great Lakes. My law partner, who you all saw last night, who was honored with the Henry King Jr. Award, has been worrying about lake levels near his home, near Lake Ontario. And of course, Lana and I look at those along Lake Michigan. The models on climate change suggested warming would cause evaporation in a lower level, Gene, but Rick Newcomb is worried that they're rising and rising, and it's driving him nuts. In fact, that was a factor in the selection of this topic for our conference. So, Lana, Commissioner, Chairperson, excuse me, John, others, what say you about lake levels and climate change? What is going on?
Well, I'll say that a couple of things. One, I've got everybody from Governor Cuomo to the town supervisor of Greece on the south shore of Lake Ontario, plus all the people up in Georgian Bay a couple of years ago, calling for my head. Get rid of the IJ. They're all wrong. The IJC, if we only change the IJC commissioners, we won't need to worry about I swear, we won't need to worry about, in this case, high water levels on Lake Ontario. And to give them, just to put a little context in it, IJC is under the treaty. We set the orders on dams where those dams are shared dams by national dams. So when the St. Lawrence the St. Lawrence Seaway was opened, new order on that dam goes back to the 50s. And putting the dam in, and with the orders, which is to say how many gates you open, under which conditions, how much flow you allow under various conditions, which is the IJC's work that has to be also approved by both governments. So what the dam did and the order did was eliminate 98% of the flooding downstream not downstream, 98% of the flooding in the basin, Lake Ontario and the upper St. Lawrence. 98% wasn't enough. People were not happy because there were still occasional floods. As Professor Tackley said, the lakes vary between 5 and up to 2 meters. Mm-hmm. So you're trying to compress it, and the lakes are too big. The main driver, Jim, is precipitation. It's also impacted by how much ice cover there is, so how much evaporation there is. But it's mainly precipitation. When you have a lot of precipitation, it runs into the lakes, and guess what happens? The lakes rise. When you have little precipitation, the lakes go down. The dam can only do so much. We changed the order on the dam after 50 years of debate and discussion and $20 million of Canadian and US money on a study, because the 1950s order compressed the waters unnaturally, and by so doing, compromised 64,000 acres of wetlands. Because in the 50s, no one paid any attention to the environment and wetlands. Come to about my term of office, this period of time, the IJC, with lots of study, lots of public input, changed the order, as the scientists would say. And in that sense, we got unlucky, because we changed it on January 1st, 2017, and then it started to rain. And it rained for 40 days, and it rained for 40 nights, and there was unprecedented amount of water, climate perhaps. And I'm not making light of the people who got flooded. I am not making light of that. That's a very serious thing to go through. Oh my goodness, it's a terrible thing to go through. But I am saying when it rains, you're likely to have flood. And changing the commissioners on the IJC is not going to change the water levels nor will it make them go up in Georgian Bay under low water periods. We spend last thing, we spend so much fighting reality and too little time figuring out how do we adjust. In this case, that's where the work on adaptation is terribly important. We can do more for the people on those things to help them live with it, but what we can't do is change the water levels.
I lived for my entire life with Great Lakes water levels, particularly in Georgian Bay. And I think there's the IGC cannot win because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
And you're damned if you damn.
And you're damned if you're damned, apparently. Very good. But I think this is where science is so important because water levels in Georgian Bay, Lake Huron go up. We've only been measuring since the late 1800s. Let's acknowledge that's a nit in the time of our history. But it has been over 100 years that we've been measuring. And if you look at the charts, it goes up. Anybody, does any boating or whatever, the charts acknowledge this. It's a 6-foot range. But if you look at, since we've been measuring, the only thing you can conclude is that it goes up and down a lot. So the historical lows were in the 1920s, the 1960s, and about 5, 6, 7 years ago it went down. It didn't stay down as low as in the 1960s, by the way, but this is where the science has to be the base because people can get really upset at their own worlds, right? Yeah. So the historical lows, 20s, 60s, and a few years ago, a few people had bought properties on Georgian Bay when the water was high because the highest levels on record were in the 1990s. To the point where National Geographic had a cover, oh my God, we're being inundated, right? The thing is, Georgian Bay has rock, and Lake Huron has soft shore. So when the water was high, people on the Lake Huron side of the shoreline were losing their cottages, losing shoreline. Panic, panic, panic. What are we going to do to stop the waters being so high? You fast forward about 30 years, because the cycles, the only thing we can conclude is that the cycles go up every 30, 40 years, right? It's a long cycle. And truth be told, nobody really understands why. Of course, precipitation, but what causes precipitation? Nobody really knows what it is. But we just know that this happens. But this is where you have to rely on science because you get people panicking about when the water then is just high, they're losing shoreline. Into Georgian Bay a couple of decades later, panicking because the water is now low, and they didn't actually do the research and bought a cottage that was far from historical, or they bought a boat that was too big for the channels, and now they're panicking, right? But they're the ones who drove to the point of wanting to sue the U.S. Corps of Engineers for having allowed the water to drop. I mean, in both cases, the important part is to say, this might be affecting you, but our job is not to shape the environment to suit any particular vested interest. We have to go back to the science and say, what is really happening and why? And water levels in Georgian Bay and Lake Huron, to me, are the best example of how we end up with people reacting because of their own vested interests or because of their own personal experiences without being able to step back and really look at the science. And I feel for the IJC. Like I said, they've been damned because they've done, and they've been damned because they've not done. Anyway, right. Grammatically that was a challenge, but you knew what I meant.
Thank you.
Now, excuse me, panel, because Professor Collaras has been very patient, waving his hand. He wants to ask a question. Giuslino. we need your I need a microphone.
He's coming over. Published a paper last year on the American Law and Economics Review, where I looked at the question that the Honorable John Godfrey mentioned, border carbon adjustments. And although, I mean, I believe climate change is happening, I do believe that we need to discuss what we should be doing about it. And I was quite sympathetic to the idea of, in the beginning, before concluding the research, of actually making the legal case and the economic policy case for BCAs. And unfortunately, although I succeeded in finding a way of demonstrating how that could be made compatible, how BCAs could be made compatible with WTO obligations.
You have a question, of course.
Yes, and the question is, so the economic case is disastrous. Recently, after Professor Bill Nordhaus won the economic prize the Nobel Prize in Economics, there was some controversy over the disagreement between some major economists, including Dr. Nordhaus, and the IPCC in terms of what would be the best policies to do to address. The IPCC seems to be addressing an agenda like what you propose of deep decarbonization, which would be quite, I mean, according to the economists, and I tend to believe the economists on these issues, disastrous to the world in terms of economic loss. So my question is, climate change is definitely a political problem, and it's in the political arena that these issues need to be debated, and this is where I think that panels like this are very important. My question to you is, what do you think, what are your ideas of making climate discussion and consideration of costs of decarbonization or relative level of decarbonization, an open discussion to the public, and what is the likelihood of actually having that being done by people who sit in parliaments and congresses? Thank you.
Now, in asking the panel to respond, I'll note that there's only 2 minutes left in our time frame, so keep your response within that if you can, please.
So 2 minutes is going to be like haiku. It would seem to me that we're balancing two kinds of risks. It's not simply a political challenge. It is a physical challenge. It is a scientific challenge. It's the absolute disaster we're facing if we don't do something. So you say to yourself, well, if we simply can't manage this economically or industrially, we'll just have to keep going. That's not an answer. I mean, it's obviously, so what it does require, and we talked a little bit about this last night, is a transformational act of our economy, which changes the basic assumptions about how we use energy and materials. That's what it comes down to. And we don't have a choice, but we didn't have a choice in the Second World War either about what we needed to do to produce armaments. We have the capacity as human society to organize ourselves for these crises when we recognize them. And so, of course, if we stick to an industrial paradigm which will produce disaster, will produce disaster. But we can't afford to do that, and happily, in the history of humankind, we're ingenious people, and this will summon up all of our ingenuity on a global basis, and we have to get it right together. We don't have a choice, so we've got to find a way to do it.
Any final observations? Lana, Martha?
My observation that this meeting is among the best I've been to. I've been going to climate change discussions. I'm married to a climate scientist. And I've been going to climate discussions since at least 1990, actually earlier than that. And I really respect what I'm hearing, and the seriousness and the wisdom with which you're offering these ideas. The last point is that a week ago I was able to hear Christiana Figueres, who is the UN ambassador for climate change and a major figure in the Paris Climate Agreement. And she said that she gave a marvelous talk, almost as good as John Godfrey's, and she said, "I am a stubborn optimist. I have to be." And all 3,000 people went out of that big hall and said, "We are stubborn optimists. We must be." So I leave you with that, and perhaps we can all be stubborn optimists in how to proceed.
Can I finish also with a note of optimism? In Canada right now, we have the federal government put forward a massive piece of legislation, which we refer to as Bill C-69, which will have tremendous impact on what we do in terms of environmental assessments, making it much broader into full impact assessments, changing how we approve of energy projects, pipelines, transmission lines. It's a massive, massive piece of legislation. We have a current government that's very concerned about climate, as they should be. The legislation was somewhat ideologically driven and was responded to by industry very, very negatively. So a few months ago, or like 18 months ago, we ended up with very polarized positions on a major piece of legislation that will affect the next at least decade of how we do things in Canada. The positive piece about this is that over the last number of months, and I can, the Canada West Foundation has been very involved in trying to move this forward. It looks like now, through a lot of discussion and a lot of collaboration between industry, between other people concerned, between them and government, that we may end up getting a piece of legislation that is significantly amended before it finally passes, that will not be perfect. It will, and that might not sound great, but the fact that it will have been reflective of compromise and collaboration on the part of all concerned, we may very well, I'm crossing fingers over the next number of months, and it will just be the next couple of months, we may end up with a massive piece of legislation in Canada that we can then go to the rest of the world and wave and say, are we ever proud of the fact that this isn't perfect? In the sense that we can have industry go out and say, not perfect, but at least we can live with it. We have environmental activists who can say, not perfect, but at least we can live with it. And then go back to the investment climate, which is saying, we need you to do this kind of thing. I'm crossing fingers. A lot of us are working really hard to make this happen. But if we can, should be by the end of June, that'll actually be an example of how we, when you want to add politics and the law and science, it could be something we're really, really proud of. I mean, classic Canadian will be really proud of something that's not perfect. But I think it could be really, it could be really something.
Well, I'm really proud of a panel that's been perfect. And I want to thank each of you, Martha, Lana, and John. You've been excellent, and we've all profited by your wisdom. Thank you very much. And now, Steve, over to you. You tell us what we have to do.
Well, first, we need to thank this outstanding